Sound check, 1, 2, 3. Sound check, 1, 2, 3.
like to call this meeting to order. I want to welcome everyone to our Development Charges Act public meeting. Madam Clerk, could we have the roll call, please? Oh,
Thank you, Mr. Warden. Councillor Mackey.
Present.
Councillor Gamble.
Present.
Councillor Burley.
Present.
Councillor Carlton. Councillor McLean.
Present.
Thank you. Councillor Desai is not. Councillor Patterson. Warden Hicks.
here.
Councillor Clumpus. Councillor Keaveney. Councillor Body. I see Councillor Body's hand up via Zoom. Thank you. Councillor O'Leary. Councillor Woodbury sends his regrets. Councillor Millen. Councillor Soever. Councillor Potter sends his regrets. Councillor Robinson. And Councillor Hutchinson.
Present.
Thank you.
So Madam Clerk, I understand you have some formalities to attend to.
Thank you, Mr. Warden. I would like to indicate that this is a statutory public meeting being held under the Development Charges Act. The public meeting is required prior to council considering any proposed changes to the development charges bylaws. In accordance with the act, the public meeting was advertised in the Owen Sound Sun-Times and the Grey Bruce this week on October 7th, 2021. And notice of the public meeting was also posted on the Grey County website on September 24th, 2021, along with a copy of the staff background report and copy of the proposed amendments to the development charges bylaw. The only correspondence received in regard to this public meeting were two resolutions from the town of the Blue Mountains and the municipality of Grey Highlands, and Mr. Schertzer will speak to those later in the meeting. And at this point in time, that's all the correspondence that has been received. And the meeting will now be passed over to Mr. Schertzer.
Great, thank you, Mr. Warden. So today we have Hutchinson Consulting, Stefan and Rachel with us that's going to provide a presentation. Presentation was shared with council ahead of time and was posted on the website, along with, of course, the development charges background study and the development charges bylaws that have been drafted to date. Those were also posted on the website. So I believe Stefan and Rachel are connected in on the Zoom, and so I'll turn it over to Stefan, who will go through the presentation.
Well, thank you, Randy. I'm going to get straight into this, and I'll just share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that and hear me. As Madam Clerk said in her introduction, this is a public meeting held under Section 12 of the Development Charges Act, and it's required prior to the county passing a new development charges bylaw. Its purpose is to provide the public with an opportunity to make representations on the 2021 development charges background study, which was released on last October 8th, and the draft development charge bylaws that were released on October the 14th prior to this meeting. I'm just going to summarize for council and the public the process by which the background study was developed, and I'll focus more specifically on the growth-related capital works that are in the study that have been identified as eligible for development charge funding. I'll speak a little bit about the maximum development charge rates that the county could impose that are also set out in the study, and I'll show how those rates, those maximum rates, compare with the development charges that are in force in similar and surrounding jurisdictions to Grey. And then I'll conclude with speaking a little bit about some of the policy provisions of the bylaws, and then briefly talk about the steps that are required from here on in order to pass new bylaws. But I'll just start with a bit of broad background so that everyone understands and is on the same page. When we're talking about development charges, we are talking about fees that are imposed by municipalities on development to pay for growth-related capital costs. So the operative words here are capital only. We can't use the charges to fund operating costs, and only to the extent that capital is related to expanding infrastructure or expanding services and facilities for growth, new growth and development. The principle behind the charges is that they can be used by the county to maintain its levels of service as the county grows, and also that the growth that does occur pays for itself through payment of the charges, so that the burden of expanding infrastructure is not borne by your existing tax and rate payers. In gray, development charges can be imposed by both levels of municipal government. So the county has a development charges for the services it provides, and the lower tier municipalities have development charges to fund the services that they're responsible for. And this particular study and this process relates only to the county charges. I mentioned the development charges are imposed by bylaw, and the maximum life of a development charge bylaw is 5 years after it comes into force. The county has 2 bylaws, one for the road service and one for the other services, and both of them expire on the 1st of January 2022. So if the county wishes to continue to impose a charge, it must pass a new bylaw or new bylaws before the end of this year. And prior to passing new bylaws, the county must undertake a background study, and it must hold at least one public meeting. The Development Charges Act establishes rules for how the background study is to be undertaken, and they're just summarized on the slide you see here. So there's a prescribed methodology for calculating the charge. Step 1 of that methodology is to do a forecast of future development. Step 2 is to analyze the level of service that the county's been providing over the last 10 years. That level of service establishes a limit on how much future infrastructure can be funded using development charges. The third step is to identify the growth-related capital costs for each of the services. And not all of those costs can be funded through the charges. We have to account for external funding that the county is going to receive to fund those works. We have to account for any portion of that new infrastructure that is going to benefit existing residents of Grey County. We have to account for any development charge monies that the county has on hand that it's collected in prior years and sitting in reserve funds that are available to fund that new infrastructure. And to the extent that certain pieces of infrastructure will provide a benefit beyond the time horizon that we're looking at, we have to exclude that so-called post-period benefit from the charge calculations as well. But with all of those deductions, we're left with a pool of costs that are eligible for development charge funding. The costs are imposed as a charge on residential development as a charge per housing unit, with a higher charge for larger unit types. And on non-residential development, the charge is imposed as a charge per square meter of new building gross floor area. As part of the background study process, the county must consider whether to impose charges on a county-wide or an area-specific basis. Currently, the county development charges are imposed on a county-wide basis. That's to say that all development in gray pays the same charge regardless of its location. There are municipalities in Ontario that levy different development charges in different areas to reflect the different needs for services. However, these area-specific charges are almost exclusively used for water, sewer, and stormwater services, where the benefiting area of the service, say for example a water pipe or a stormwater pond, can be clearly delineated on a map. The benefits of the services that the county provides are much more evenly distributed. They are network benefits, like the road network, and all residents have equal access to the road network, to the county trail network, to the social services and other services that the county provides. And so given the servicing structure, the background study recommends that the charges continue to be implemented on a county-wide basis. And this recommendation follows direction provided by your Development Charges Steering Committee on April 13th, 2021, after the committee had considered the use of area-specific charges. So I'm just going to go through the steps involved in the background study. I'll focus more on some than others. Step one is the development forecast. The charges have been calculated using two time horizons. One is a 10-year horizon, and that's used to calculate the charges for all of the services except for the roads. The roads charge is established on a 20-year time horizon extending to 2041. And this is consistent with the previous background study and the current charges that are in place. The forecasts are also consistent with the recently approved county growth management strategy update. So for the residential development charge, growth is assumed to be about 5,100 dwelling units and 8,300 people between now and 2031. And the growth forecasts of about 9,700 dwelling units and 17,600 people between now and 2041. The non-residential development charges are based on forecasts of job growth and associated growth in non-residential building space. And they too are consistent with the growth management strategy. So it's 3,400 additional jobs to and 241,000 square meters of new floor space between now and 2031, and about 6,900 jobs and 491,000 square meters of new floor space between now and 2041. I mentioned earlier that the development charges are used to fund growth-related or development-related capital works. And the background study includes a development-related capital program for each service. The legislation requires that the capital programs reflect council's intentions. So the programs have been compiled with reference to the county's capital budgets, capital forecasts, and in consultation with county staff and the Development Charge Steering Committee. The costs have been adjusted to account for all of the deductions that I mentioned a little bit earlier. I'm just going to go through each one of the services for which we've calculated a charge and just highlight the major capital works that are included in the capital program. So the land ambulance charge includes a program of around just over $3 million over the next 10 years. No grants or subsidies have been identified. As you can see, there is a small component of the cost that has been considered to benefit existing residents and is removed from the calculation. The county has around $226,000 of land ambulance development charge reserve funds on hand to fund these costs. And a significant portion of the costs, about $1.7 million, is going to be representing the expansion of facilities to service growth beyond 2031. So we have about $1 million that have been included in the charge between the 2022 and 2031 time period. Those projects include the purchase of two new cardiac monitors, defibrillators, a portion of the ongoing debt repayment on the 2018 expansion of the Chatsworth Station, and costs associated with a proposed new expansion of the Durham-based facility. For social housing, if you look at the column, the 2022 to 2031 column, that represents the costs of social housing that have been brought into the development charge calculation. So it's $4.3 million. And that is associated with the county's commitment to add to its social housing stock, and been identified 13 new social housing units in Dundalk and another 30 new units in Durham. For children's services, there's been no identified need for any expansion of facilities, but the county has identified a need to undertake a study that will look at future expansion needs, and a portion of the cost of that study has been brought into the charge. So $39,000 brought into the charge for children's services. For parks services, the trails component of the park service, this includes a number of projects over the next 10 years that generally cover improvements to existing facilities to accommodate a growing demand on the trail network and associated amenities. So it could include things like the expansion of parking areas, trail improvements, the purchase of new benches, privies, signage, landscaping, and these are taking place across the county, and it's only the expansion components of these investments that are included in the development charge. It's about $173,000 included in the charge calculation over the next 10 years. The county currently has a charge for the Grey Bruce Public Health Unit. It reflects expenditures that the county made when that unit was first constructed or expanded about 15 years ago. And it has been raising development charges over the past 15 years to pay for the growth-related component that it paid for at the time. And those payments have now, there's a few payments left, but they can be funded through the existing reserve funds that the county has on hand. And so therefore there's no additional charge that is required under this bylaw. So to be clear, no charge has been calculated for the public health unit. In long-term care, the study reflects the county's commitment to a major refurbishment and expansion to the Rockwood Terrace facility in the next few years, including the creation of 28 new beds as part of that refurbishment and expansion. It's a $56.7 million cost, and provincial funding in the amount of $28.9 million has been identified. And there is also a significant benefit to existing component of this investment to reflect the fact that a lot of what is taking place is in fact a replacement of an existing facility, a like-for-like replacement of an existing facility. Nevertheless, a significant portion of the costs, $5.5 million, have been brought into the development charge calculation. A charge has been calculated to fund studies that are associated with planning for growth. Those include official plan, background studies, the growth management study and housing study updates, the long-term care strategy, and the transit master plan, for example. And so $57,000 have been brought into the development charge calculation for the development related studies. And this is just a summary of the sort of non-roads related services. I'm just going to work along the bottom row here. So it's a gross cost of all the services of $78 million over the next 10 years. We've picked up the $28.9 million of provincial funding for Rockwood Terrace. There's about $22 million of that program that is going to benefit existing residents. Just under $800,000 of available reserve funds to fund these works. And about $11 million that has been brought into the development charge calculation. And then a significant amount, about $15.5 million, that's related to expansion that will benefit development beyond 2031, particularly for the larger facilities like the Rockwood Terrace expansion, the Durham land ambulance expansion, and some of the social housing as well. Just going to cover off the roads and related works. So there is has been identified a facility expansion for the Public Works Patrol D facility, and a portion of that has been brought into the Public Works charge, $262,000. And I'm going to spend a little bit more time just speaking about the roads program. Roads is the most significant component of the overall development charge that the county levies. And there are several categories of roads projects, and they are treated somewhat differently when we determine the eligible costs that can be brought into the charge. And I'll go into the different categories in a second, but I just wanted to sort of give you a sense here of the scale of the roads program, and it's obviously it dwarfs the costs that we were just discussing for the other services. So moving along the bottom line here, you can see over the next 20 years, it's a $157 million roads program, about $11 million of grants or subsidies that are available to fund it. A significant portion of the cost, more than a third, is going to benefit existing residents. There's about $18 million sitting in the gray roads reserve fund, which is quite significant and has had a bearing on the charge that has been calculated. And we've brought about $68 million into the charge calculation. And then there's about $3 million that represents a post-period benefit for some of the roads that are being constructed towards the later part of the 20 years. I'm just going to go through each one of those categories. So the category 1 projects represent major road expansions, including the construction of new road links altogether and the provision for land acquisition for those road links. These works generally respond to increased traffic across the network arising from growth and development that's occurring. That is to say, if we didn't have development at all in gray, these works probably wouldn't be needed. They're generally located, you can see on the map here, the red, particularly in the zoomed in boxes, the red segments represent the projects that we're talking about. And they're generally located in the town of the Blue Mountains, the city of Owen Sound, and then there's also Grey Road 4 to the east of the town of Hanover. The Category 2 projects include improvements that have the effect of changing the classification of a road from rural to urban, or the road surface. This has the effect of improving traffic flow and increasing the capacity of the road network to accommodate additional traffic. These works are much more widely distributed across the county, although there are quite a number that are focused in around Owen Sound. The Category 3 projects are projects that result in the widening of a roadway in order to improve sight lines, shoulders, shoulder widths, and other features that will improve traffic flow. And in some cases, a wider road platform will allow the county to install bike lanes and routes for active transportation, particularly near urban areas. And again, the distribution of these platform widening projects is much more widespread than the Category 1 projects. The fourth category are much more specific improvements to intersections to respond to increased traffic flow at specific locations. They include the installation of new roundabouts to replace existing intersections, to install traffic lights to control traffic flow, and to construct new turning lanes, particularly when they're required to access new subdivisions that are being developed close by. And then the Category 5 and 6, these are sort of smaller components, certainly in respect of costs. So in Category 5, we have the extension and widening of 5 culverts, and in Category 6 includes or covers the roads growth-related studies. So that would include updates to your transportation master plan, cycling plans, active transportation plans, EAs and local traffic studies, and also urban area drainage studies. Just going to speak a little bit now about the the development charges that have been calculated in the background study. And as I say, these represent the maximum charges the county could impose. So for the residential charges, they would be just under $9,000 for a single detached unit, $6,400 for a semi-detached, a row house, or another type of multiple unit, and then $5,200 per apartment unit. We've made a slight change to the structure of the charges that are shown here at the direction of the Development Charge Steering Committee. So the semi-detached units in your current bylaws is lumped in with the singles, and that's now been moved into the row category. You can see on the right, the pie chart, that the vast majority of the charge, the residential charge, relates to the roads, 70% of the total charge. But the social housing and the long-term care components are also quite significant as well, 11% and 15% respectively. On the non-residential side, the maximum charge is $31.28 per square meter of new floor area. And here it's overwhelmingly a roads charge, 94% of the charge. We don't calculate a charge, a non-residential charge for long-term care or social housing, as we see the demands for those services being driven entirely by the residential sector. This slide just compares the charge the residential charge for a single detached unit that's in place under the current bylaw, which is $7,524 a unit, with the maximum calculated charge of $8,968. It's a difference of $1,444 per unit, around a 19% increase in the current charge. You can see when you look at it on a service by service basis, there's quite a lot of variation as to how the services have changed. So, you know, a lot of the increase relates to the long-term care and social housing, and you don't actually currently have a charge for long-term care and social housing. So these are new elements to the charge and cover more than the increase that has been brought forward. And in fact, for many of the charges, including the roads, the charge has come down somewhat. And some of that's a reflection of the reserve funds that the county has on hand and has been collecting some time for these projects, particularly on the road side. And this is just another breakdown of the non-residential rate. Again, at 94% of the $31 per square meter relates to the roads. This is how the residential charge stacks up against some of the charges that are imposed by other county jurisdictions in Ontario. So you can see right now the current gray charge in red in the middle there, $7,500 a unit. And the newly calculated charge would sort of still keep you in the middle ranks, so to speak, of some of the other jurisdictions that are imposed here. And it would push you a little bit higher than what the County of Peterborough is currently charging. Although I should point out that the County of Peterborough has got a study underway, and that is going to be completed in the new year. So I would expect that charge, at least in theory, will go up. And you can see that Simcoe County right now has just undertaken a study, went to public meeting earlier in the week. They have a $10,000 per unit charge, and the newly calculated charge is around $14,500. A lot of that is related to long-term care and social housing as well. On the non-residential side, on the commercial side, Grey County does not currently have a charge for any kind of non-residential development. The charge that's been calculated in the background study, the $31 per square meter charge, would put the county sort of squarely in the middle of the range of charges that are imposed by other county jurisdictions. Certainly above Peterborough, Oxford, and Dufferin and Wellington, but well below Middlesex and the new county charge in Simcoe that they are considering. Should point out that this is the charge imposed on commercial development. So there are some jurisdictions that reduce their charges for commercial development, and for industrial development, there are a number of county jurisdictions that will heavily discount or outright exempt industrial development from payment of the charges. And then just going to finish up by talking a little bit about the policy provisions of the bylaws that have been put forward. The bylaws are essentially, right now, there's no major policy changes that have been proposed. So there are exemptions that the county is required to provide from the payment of DCs, and they're listed at the top here. Boards of education, municipalities are exempt from payment. Expansions to industrial buildings up to 50% of the existing building is also exempt. And there are fairly new changes to the Development Charges Act that would exempt all new, all secondary units, whether they're attached or detached from existing homes or from new homes that are being built. Over and above the statutory exemptions, the county also provides exemptions for hospitals, church uses, agricultural uses, farm buildings, and accommodation for seasonal or temporary agricultural laborers. Those are very common exemptions, particularly in rural areas. Less common, as we've already seen, is the flat exemption on all non-residential uses. As I say, there are some municipalities that have discounts or exemptions for industrial uses, but it's quite rare to have, certainly in faster growing places, it's quite rare to have a flat exemption on all non-residential uses. There were some other exemptions that were introduced by the county into the development charges bylaws last year, and those have been carried forward in the new bylaws. And I don't propose to go through these in much detail. They have very detailed criteria attached to them, and I know that you only just dealt with these. But the purpose-built rental housing, non-profit housing, secondary units. There are some redevelopment credits available where non-residential uses are converting to residential uses. And there are development charge exemptions also conditionally available for projects that are approved through your community improvement plan. So those have all, as I say, been carried forward into the draft bylaws that have been released. Just some final provisions, and these are more sort of administrative than anything else, but you do have indexing provisions in the bylaws that allow the county to index the charges on an annual basis on January the 1st every year. There is a rule that provides a credit from payment of DCs, provided somebody tears down a building and replaces it and redevelops on the property within a 5-year time frame. And there are also rules that provide for allow the county to enter into agreements with developers to alter the timing of payment of the charges. So just going to finish up by talking about where we've come from and where we go. We started the process back in April, and we've had a number of presentations and discussions with your development charge steering committee. And certainly similar discussions with staff, and we've met with every representatives from every department for which we've calculated a charge. As I say, the background study has been completed and has been released to the public, as have the bylaws. This is the statutory public meeting that is required. We've tried to ensure that there's a period over the coming weeks where we can respond to any submissions that are made arising from this public session, with a view to bringing forward the bylaws for council consideration and passage in December, in time, well, before they expire on the 1st of January. So that concludes my presentation, and Madam Clerk, and Mr. Chairman, I'm happy, of course, to answer any questions members of the public or indeed council may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Randy. Before I turn things over to you, I'm going to suggest that we just stand up for 2 minutes just to stretch our legs. Yeah.
Your head, Bob.
Are we still good, Rob? Okay, that was less than 2 minutes, but Randy, back to you.
Thank you, Warden Hicks. That was good to stretch. It's been a long sitting day for sure for council. So just to summarize some of the comments that we received, as Heather mentioned earlier. So we've received 2 resolutions passed by the Town of the Mountains Council and the Municipality of Grey Highlands Council. The motions request that the capital costs associated with the Grey Gables redevelopment form part of the background considerations in the development charges study. So if just to speak to this, and I think this was just to summarize, and Stefan can jump into in terms of if I've misstated anything based on what was discussed with the DC steering committee at the last meeting. If the status of this project changes and council decided to unpause this project, council would have the option of changing the development charges bylaws within 1 year of the DC background study being completed. So that was when it was posted on October 8th to the county website. So essentially we have till October 8th of 2022 to make any changes to the development charges bylaw. An additional public meeting would still be required at that time to consider those changes, but we wouldn't have to actually update the DC background study in order to make that change. The second option is that council could also make changes to the DC bylaws after that 1 year time frame and up to the next DC update, which would be in 5 years' time. This would require a scoped development charges background study update and as well as a public meeting in order to consider any bylaw changes. So there are those two options that council would have if things were to change with respect to the status of that project. If for example, the additional funding was provided from the province to be able to support that project, for example, then council could have the option of unpausing that, so to speak, and then adding that back into the DC study. I did speak with Stefan on this prior to this meeting. If the Development Charges Steering Committee and or council decides to add this back in, because we're maximizing the current DC funding envelope for long-term care, we wouldn't be able to collect more development charges within the next 5 years. It would also adjust calculations in terms of benefit to existing and other things that we'd have to be eligible DCs for both long-term care builds, if both were to be captured in the DC background study, would then need to capture in future DC updates. So that's a possibility. It's just, I just want to highlight that we are maximizing essentially the funding envelope for long-term care. So we actually wouldn't be collecting any further DC charges by adding that project back in. All these, of course, comments and any other comments we've received up to the DC Steering Committee meeting will be summarized for the DC Steering Committee, and we'll have that discussion with the DC Steering Committee on November 15th. But I just wanted to highlight for council's awareness what was discussed at the DC Steering Committee. There are no other written comments that have been received to date. But like I said, if we do receive any further comments, we'll summarize those and bring those forward to the DC Steering Committee. And that's all the comments I have at this stage.
Thank you, Randy. How do you suggest we proceed now? Do we want to invite public comment, or do we want to invite council comment, or do we? I'm gathering that we'll wait for council comment until the very end. Correct? Yeah. Okay, so we're probably moving towards public comment then. Very good. So I'll let you, because you have the list. I'll let you take charge of that.
So we did ask people to pre-register prior to tonight's meeting. When we advertise this public meeting with a hybrid model, we can now have both in person and virtual. So I know one person is here in person, and 3 are connected virtually, I believe. So we had Nathan Jameson. That was one of the persons that registered prior to. So I don't know if Nathan is on the line, and if he wants to provide any questions or comments that he has with respect to this.
Nathan, if you could unmute your microphone. There we go.
I did. My apologies. Technical, the joys of virtual. I think we'd have it figured out by now. Thank you for the opportunity to speak, and thank you, Stefan, for the presentation. I did just have a few questions on reviewing the background study, and I'll just go through them. One question regarding the adjusted residential and non-residential DC. Can you provide some information on the 5.5% interest rate was determined for borrowing costs. I think that was in the table 3 cash flow analysis. Just trying to get an understanding of what current borrowing costs are and the rationale behind the 5.5%.
Yes, through you, Mr. Chairman. Well, I'll give you, Mr. Jameson, the cash flow assumptions. So we've assumed an inflation rate of 2%, which we just had the non-residential construction price index released today, and it's running at 11%. So that's probably a little off, but an inflation rate of 2%. That's over the next 20 years. And then an interest rate of 5.5% is used for borrowing on the funds that are in the reserve funds. And an interest rate of 3.5% is applied when there's a positive balance in the fund.
So what could I ask what the current borrowing rate is? Just I know the bank also just provided some information today on interest rates. And I guess more where my question is going is there an opportunity to possibly phase in this rate rather than being immediate, just based on current borrowing rates?
Well, I don't know what the bank's rate is today, Mr. Chairman. Certainly county council has the option to, I don't know whether the question was about phasing in the development charges or making adjustments to the assumptions in the cash flow. I would not recommend making assumption changes to the cash flow because we don't get into that level of detail where we actually try and forecast the Bank of Canada rate over the next 20 years. That's a bit too detailed for what we're trying to do here, but certainly if you're asking about phasing in the development charges, that's certainly an option for council to consider.
Okay. Maybe I'll just get to another question if I can. In terms of the DC charge, I believe in the past there's been no non-residential charge, and I'm just curious in terms of how this has been accounted for in the reserve fund.
So through you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Schertzer may want to weigh in on this as well, but the general practice, as far as I'm aware, is that the county pays into the fund to offset the exemption that's provided. So when a non-residential developer comes forward, the county calculates the charge that they otherwise would have been responsible to pay and then makes a payment into the reserve fund to ensure the reserve funds are kept whole.
So I guess what I'm hearing then is that has been the process to date in terms of when not collecting for the non-residential charge.
That's correct, Mr. Chairman.
A couple of questions.
One second, if I might, Mr. Jameson. I think Mr. Schertzer would like to add something to that.
For sure.
Yeah, thank you for that question. And as Stefan indicated, essentially what we do is we recognize that there's some exemptions that council's provided. So when we're calculating the overall DC eligible costs in the DC background study for that particular project, we estimate what that percent is that that council is exempted through those exemptions, and only then can calculate on a percent basis what is actually DC eligible based on what we currently charge. And then the rest of the funds then would be made up through other sources of funding, which include levy increases, as well as other funding that we might be able to access through provincial and federal government.
Okay. So basically the reserve funds then that were listed in the DC background study are essentially whole for the non-res component from prior to the 2021, I guess what we're referring to.
That's correct, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you for that. Next question related to social housing. I know this is something new that's been added. Is there a waiting list currently with respect to social housing within the county?
I'll maybe get Anne Marie to answer this.
Thank you. Yes, we do have a waiting list in all parts of Grey County for housing, just like right across the province. There is a wait list. When we look at Grey County residents that are on the list, we're up around that 700 to 800 people waiting for housing.
Okay. And I assume then the similar would be, is it fair to say there would be a similar waiting list than under the long-term care component?
No, these are strictly for Grey County housing, so it's independent housing.
Okay. Okay. But I guess maybe the next question then in terms of long-term care, is there a waiting list for long-term care or?
Mr. Schertzer will add something here.
Yeah, the demand, no doubt, for long-term care it continues to increase and we expect that to continue to increase based on our aging demographic and based on some of the population projections that were formed part of this background study that Hutchinson also helped to address as part of our growth management study update prior to this DC exercise.
Okay, and I guess maybe then the question to that is if there's a waiting list, is that accounted for in terms of the benefit to existing as it relates to the charge for the social housing and the long-term care?
Well, through you, Mr. Chairman, I would say that the new social housing that is being built is not even going to be enough to allow the county to maintain its current level of service for social housing, even if you measure on a beds per capita. So whether there's a waiting list or not, in order to maintain its level of service to 2031, the county should be building more housing than what we've included in the background study. So to the extent that the county is allowed to fund the service up to the historical level of service ceiling, it's not hitting that ceiling yet, whether there's a waiting list or not.
Okay. Thank you for that. I think just my last question relates to the roads and related component of the DC. I was just trying to understand the capital programs or the projects listed in the appendix material. Are those projects, are they all based on the I think it was the transportation master plan that the county had completed back in, I think it was 2014. Is that what is used to derive the listing of the projects?
So through you, Mr. Chairman, and I may rely on others to assist, but certainly that is the basis of the program, recognizing that there's been some changes since then, not just in terms of the growth outlook, but also perhaps, the scope, the cost, and maybe even the list of projects.
So there, I guess what I'm hearing that is it's a combination of potentially the TMP plus county priorities that may have evolved from that time.
I think, Mr. Chairman, I'll leave it to Mr. Hoy to expand on the details there.
Yeah, I could respond to that. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and many of them we've done some traffic studies and they've given us kind of some projected years that some of these major road improvements should happen. So yeah, kind of a combination of things out of the OP, some of the our higher volume roads and or higher class roads in the official plan, and a series of traffic studies, and then also stuff from the master plan. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you. And I guess maybe the next two questions on that is trying to understand how the benefit to existing is calculated based on the various classifications. I think there's 5 or 6 classifications or project categories that are shown, and there seems to be a range of benefit to existing. And I guess I'm just trying to understand how that was determined. I know in other background studies, we've seen that based on trip generations, and I'm just trying to understand how this one is. If it's, it didn't seem like it was coming from a TMP, but it was more. It almost seemed to be like almost a cost projection. So I'm just kind of looking for clarity on that. I didn't quite follow it.
Well, through you, Mr. Chairman, I guess one of the principal reasons for categorizing the roads in the way that we have is to address the question of the benefit to existing. So it is different depending on the category. There's a breakdown of the methodology or the general approach on page 132 of the background study. I can certainly take you through it, but it'd be a fairly lengthy response if I do. Suffice to say that, the general principle behind the major costs, which are the category 1 projects, is to say that is to try and determine the cost the county would incur to maintain what is there already over the next 20 years in its existing class, in its existing road class. So we take the length of road, the existing class, and the cost to do a regular resurfacing or reconstruction over a 20-year period. And we say that's what the county would need to spend in order to maintain the existing segment in its, in a state of good repair. The remainder of the cost associated with the project is considered to be the growth-related cost. That is the cost that forms part of the project that is now required because of the growth and development, whereas the other costs you would have to do in the absence of any growth whatsoever. So that's the general principle that's applied. For some of the other projects, like things like the intersection improvements, it's a bit more high level. We take a sort of a percentage, a flat percentage, depending on the type of improvement that's taking place. So, where there's a new turning lane, for example, that is a new road link. That we fund 100%. But if it's new traffic in signal installation, we've taken a benefit to existing of 25% off for that. And there are some similar sort of high level percentages applied for roundabouts and that sort of thing. And that's applied to the culverts and the studies as well. So it's a different approach depending on the category, but I think certainly there's a significant portion of the overall costs that have been recognized as a BTE.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, and I think category 1 is really more where I was looking at. That's probably the larger quantum of costs, and yeah, we're just trying to understand, because I think the costs used to define the total project cost is I think it's a benchmark that you're using. I saw in some of the background work there was just on a cost per kilometer basis for 2-lane or 4-lane. So you're basically saying it's an estimate. It's based on a maintenance estimate over a total cost estimate is what's used for the allocation, as opposed to trip generations from existing versus projected.
That's correct, Mr. Chairman. Yeah.
Okay. And I guess just my last question as it relates to the roads is, I noted that there was a deferral of 2.9 million in the post-period benefits, I guess under table C 2-2. How is that derived? Like, I know there is timing included within the table, and typically the period is up to 2041 and the post benefit being, post 2041. But I'm just trying to understand how the certain projects are allocated to either be within the benefiting period and the post benefiting period.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, there's really no science to that. I think when we looked at the program, we looked at those particular road segments, and we said, I think in discussions with staff, we acknowledged that, because those roads were being constructed at the very end of the period, it was probably appropriate to allocate a portion of them as a post period, even though the county is not spending the roads, is not recovering what it could through the development charge to maintain its service level. We just felt that, if a road was being built in 2038 or 2039, that it was probably, fair to recognize that there was going to be a post-period benefit, but there was no sort of scientific method to it.
Yeah, I did notice in some of the other categories, there was some other projects, say 2037, 2038 that weren't within a post benefit. And I just wasn't sure how, one project was chosen over another, and just trying to look for the rationale in that. And it sounds like I don't want to say arbitrary, but it sounds like if it was a larger project towards the end of the period, it was assumed then that some would carry over into the post benefit. Is that a fair statement?
That's right, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. I think that's really, appreciate the responses. That's really the only questions I had. I think what I assume I should probably do is just more formulate these questions and send them through the forum here. And I assume by what I heard through the start of the meeting is council and staff were going to accept public feedback over the next couple of weeks prior to making a motion on this in December.
Go ahead, Randy.
Yeah, that's correct. If you have any further written comments, obviously we're taking notes and we're recording this session, so we'll go back and revisit some of this as well and summarize all the comments received both verbally and in written format, and identify any proposed changes based on some of those comments received, which we'll have that discussion with the Development Charges Steering Committee on November 15th. So if you do have any further written comments, or anyone has any further written comments, I'd recommend that you send those in as soon as you can, so that we have those in time for the discussion with the steering committee in mid-November.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Jameson. Randy, before you go to the next person, we're going to stand up again. Just take another stretch. We need it. Okay, Randy, back to you. We'll go with the next delegate.
So next I have on my list is Stephen Townsend, and I believe he's here. No, sorry, he's connecting on the virtual call today. Okay, sorry, it is. I thought that was. How you doing? So Stephen said he's just here in attendance and doesn't have any questions at this time. So the next on the list we have is Rob McLeese.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Let me see, I can start my video too.
Yeah.
There,
There
okay.
you go.
Thank you very much, sorry. And this question is probably for Mr. Kruzunowicz and for Mr. Scherzer, but one of the points was made is that all developers are being treated equally and across the board. And one of the things that concerns me a little bit is given that Cobble Beach has built its own wastewater treatment plant, built its own water tower, expanded the wastewater or the water treatment system, done that all at our own cost with no support from anybody locally or federally or provincially. Does it not make sense to at least give some kind of a credit to a community that's doing everything? There's no question we need to contribute, obviously, to the roads, the hospital, social services, the trail network. No question. But in terms of major works that are being undertaken by us at our sole cost, is that something that can be taken into consideration? I'll leave that question there. Thank you for
Randy?
my question.
Thank you for that question, Rob, and nice to see you virtually.
Nice to see you.
Hope you're keeping well.
Thank you.
With respect to your question, I think right now, as it currently stands, water and wastewater is dealt with respect to the local municipalities. So the county charge doesn't include any water and wastewater with respect to capital projects and capital improvements for growth-related costs. So if, for example, for Cobble Beach, if Georgian Bluffs had a development charge, for example, that may be something that you'd want to explore as part of that exercise, because as you correctly noted, Cobble Beach put up that upfront investment in order to service your development. So at that time, there'd be considerations, I would think, for area rate charges. And as Stefan indicated early on in the meeting, that's typically where we see area rate charges applied, is on the water and wastewater side when it comes to development charges. But because that's a local municipal responsibility, that would be collected as part of a local municipal development charge, not at the county level.
Okay, thank you.
Is that it, Mr. McLeese?
That's it. And thank you very much for all the excellent work you do. We appreciate it.
Thank you, sir. Randy, back over to you.
So next we had on the list was Doug Hutchinson. I don't know if Doug's connecting virtually. If he has any questions. If Doug's not on, then I think that's all that we had pre-register anyways. And I don't see anyone else in attendance today. So I'll turn it back over to you, Mr. Warden, see if.
I'm sorry, I think I cut you off, Randy, right at the end there. My apologies. Okay, yes, there's nobody else physically here, but can we just maybe canvass online and see if there's anyone? Maybe if there are people online, could you please put your hand up if you are wishing to speak? Your virtual hand. Those are all staff, okay. So it does not look like we have any other participants wishing to speak. That said, we're back over to council now. And I just don't know, Madam Clerk, I'm trying to find out just how much debate is council going to have, given that what I'm hearing about the process is that this is going back to the Development Charges Steering Committee. So I think it's appropriate that we ask maybe a few questions of clarification, but this is going to be going back through a process. Okay, so I'll open it to council if you have any burning questions that you need to have answered now. Councillor Mackey.
Thanks, Mr. Warden, and through you to Randy. Randy, can you help me understand the fairness? The amount proposed for a residential is 8968, and then I believe for smaller semis or for semis, it's 6,000. So I guess I'm trying to wrap my head around someone downsizing wants to build a 2-bedroom house, in their retirement, are going to be paying the same as a 6-bedroom, 6-bathroom, 5,000 square foot house. I'm struggling with that one a little bit.
Thank you. And I might defer some of this to Stefan because I know that he has previous experience with respect to this. We did at one point have a square footage charge that we applied. So we had ranges of residential charges by square feet. That was 2 versions ago, I guess, of the development charges. And at the time, at the last DC update, prior to this DC update, it was recommended to move away from that model. I think there was some challenges that were successful at the Ontario Municipal Board with respect to applying a charge based on a square footage basis. So that's, I think, why Hutchinson had recommended at that time that we move to a model where it's applied to the actual type of dwelling versus a square footage of dwelling. I don't know, Stefan, if you have anything further to add with respect to that.
Yeah, through you, Mr. Chairman. And Randy, it wasn't strictly speaking a square foot charge that was in place. It was actually a per unit charge, but the units were defined by their square feet. So it wasn't a true square foot charge, and there is no development charge in Ontario that is a residential development charge that's based on a straight square foot basis. And the reason really fundamentally is that this is a charge that's imposed to reflect benefits that are received. And, you know, when we talk about, you know, who places the demand on municipal services and who gets the benefit of municipal services, it's sometimes quite difficult to establish that based on the size of a property. We also have to be very careful too, because, you know, we cannot, this is not a charge that can be calculated based on the ability of any one person to pay it. So just because, you know, someone has a large house doesn't necessarily mean that the county road network needs to be bigger in order to accommodate that house. You still need, you know, you still need the same land ambulance services if there's the same number of people living in that house, regardless of the size of the house. So there are, as Randy mentioned, there, you know, there are some legal issues at play here, and it really is rooted in the idea that this is not a charge that can be based on the ability to pay principal, which is it's based on the benefits that are received, and that's why we calculate the charge based on the number of people living in a unit.
Okay, good, Councillor Mackey. Thank you. Sorry, anyone else? Oh, Councillor Soever, go ahead.
Yes, Randy, you mentioned that the date on the for the long-term care, that it would be one date from completion of the study, and you mentioned October 8th, 2021. Why would the study be considered complete when we're still discussing comments, and would it not be considered complete when it's approved by council?
Go ahead, Randy.
Stefan can correct me if I'm wrong on this. I believe it's in the Development Charges Act. It's when we post the Development Charges background study for this particular public meeting is the year cut. It's when it's calculated, that year time frame. But Stefan can correct me if I'm wrong on that.
Well, through you, Mr. Chairman, and Randy's correct, although the Act is not actually clear on this. And so what the Act does say is that the study must be released 60 days in advance of the county passing the bylaw. So you won't be able to pass the bylaw before December the 8th or December the 7th or whatever it is, because the background study has to be available. But there are a number of municipalities that will issue a final version of the study if there are any changes made that need to be made as a result of the public process. And we've done that many times, and we would redate the study and call that the final version at that time. We can certainly do that in this case as well. If you know, if there's an interest in you know, advancing the actual final date of release, I don't see a problem under the legislation with doing that.
Thank you. One more, Mr. Warden. It's with regards to the roads projects and the master transportation plan, which it was not actually approved by council, although certain parts, things in it have been approved subsequently. But in particular, I think it's category 2, the road reclassification. But outside of the road reclassification, the contentious part in the master transportation plan was transfers of roads from the Grey County to the lower tiers and lower tiers up, and those were never approved. So how do we deal with that when we know there are township roads that probably should have been transferred, but because the master transportation plan was never approved, they weren't, and they probably, so they're not in the existing service levels because they're the jurisdiction of another municipality, the lower tier. And how do you factor that in? Because we do have the 10-year capital program, but a lot of it seems to be based on a plan that's quite old and has never been approved.
Are we going to you or Pat? Okay, go ahead, Randy.
I'll take a start, and Pat can assist as well. With respect to that particular matter in terms of what we call the even length trades, so to speak, in terms of the transportation master plan, those were supported in principle by County Council. There was a number of action items that council supported back in 2015 following the transportation master plan. The one that was not supported, of course, was the road rationalization piece. That was the most controversial piece, but there were definitely some other actions that council supported and recommended. We've since implemented through our official plan update, and I know Pat and his team are working on actively trying to address some of those other actions that were supported by council, including looking at these matters. We don't have accurate costs with respect to what those even like trades would be. So that's something that we'll be working on, and we can once we have those accurate costs, then those can be brought forward to council and then reflected and identified in, say, for example, a future DC update, or it could be an interim update to this current DC. But at this stage, we don't have accurate capital costs to be able to include some of those if we wanted to, if council wanted to proceed with moving forward with some of those in a transition plan, because those would have to be done over a series of years in order to consider those, because there would be considerable improvements to some of those sections prior to them being a county road per se.
Thank you, Pat. Did you want to add something to that?
I could add something very quickly, just that really we kind of will have to work with the network that we have. We can't assume that any other even length exchanges are going to go through, or any of the connecting link. No one has gone through the full monetary calculation and how you upload or download roads and trade roads, etc. So we kind of have to stick with what we have. And the other thing is, just as far as timing, we're kind of trying to do our best here. The master plan didn't really say, road widening in this area is going to happen in this year. This is going to go 4-laning in this year. We've been doing traffic studies as we go to try to get a better idea for this bylaw, to pick an accurate year for when 4-laning, for example, would happen. So that stuff wasn't really covered off in the master plan. So we kind of have to, we're making additional information and collecting it to try to accurately predict kind of our potential future based on traffic, etc.
Very good, Councillor Sliver. Okay. I do not see any other hands, or am I missing someone? Oh, how could I forget about you? Deputy Warden McQueen, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Mr. Warden, County Council, viewing public, our staff, and Stefan. A couple questions. Thank you for the explanation with regards to Grey Gables and your maxing out the full amount that you can for long-term care. I certainly understand of it being on pause. There was a lot of uncertainty why it was taken off the project list, in the sense that it was put on pause, but obviously if we get that back on the rails, there's an opportunity to get that back into the fray of or in the process of on the DC charge. My question is also is a couple things. It was great a few years back where we were able to take the DC charge off the secondary units, because I truly believe that, and I think the rest of us did as well, that that was sort of a good thing to do, because it sort of helps build a little bit of attainable, affordable homes, or an option for families to create opportunities with that. But just taking that a little bit further, has there been any consideration? And I know we always struggle with the option or the ability to have developers build smaller homes that are from the affordable size. And I know in Grey Highlands, we removed the minimum size of 1,000 square feet from our bylaws, so then you can build something that's quite a bit smaller. That and through the building code, there is ways of doing it. There's certain requirements you have to do through the building code. So my question to County Council and maybe the consultant is, was there any consideration of having no development charge for a unit under 1,000 square feet? And the reason I say that is sometimes you got to create some incentives. Sometimes you got to create that carrot. I know there's still the use of the system, and I know it talks about the part of our infrastructure and that, but we always seem to struggle with trying to get people to do that. And sometimes incentives, go a long way. And I just wondered, has any other jurisdiction done that? And is that something that we could consider in the sense of creating that incentive to get, because as we know, this past year or the past few years, the cost of housing has skyrocketed, and sometimes, we just sometimes those little things need to happen. So it's a two-pronged question: is has other jurisdictions done this, and secondly, is that something we could consider? Thank you.
Randy, do you want to take that one?
I might have to turn the first part over that to Stefan, just based on his knowledge and experience of working with other municipalities. So whether or not any municipalities have provided exemption for a certain square footage of housing, I'm not familiar if anyone has done that. The other, I guess, thing that I think we'd want to research a bit further is what are we seeing in terms of square footage of units, and just to try to get a sense of what that could be if council, for example, decided to set a certain square footage and exempt anything from that square footage under. We'd want to at least assess what we are seeing, and what we are seeing for new developments anyways is definitely more multi-residential developments. With respect to those multi-residential dwellings, usually those are smaller square footage. So I think some of those units are likely going to be less than the 1,000 square feet that we are starting to see more of. And a lot of that is, as Councillor McQueen has indicated, is being driven by construction costs and just the overall cost of housing. Is that in order to actually get into the housing market, people are looking at smaller square footages. I think also the overall trend, especially for younger generations, is to have a smaller footprint. With respect to things like climate change and everything else, people are recognizing that having a smaller square footage home is not only more affordable, but it's also has a less of an impact on the environment, and that's front and center in people's minds for sure. So I think we'd want to have some further research in terms of what we're actually seeing on the ground, because if we were to exempt certain square footages and we were starting to see a trend to smaller square footages, then we could have a significant impact from a funding perspective on not collecting DCs going forward, which then we would have to make up the difference through other funding sources, as I mentioned earlier, through increase in levy funds, as well as other funding sources. So I know I think our Director of Finance, Mary Lou Spicer, would probably want to make sure that we've researched that well to be able to understand what that impact could be.
Stefan, did you want to add something to that?
Just, Mr. Chairman, that I can't think of a jurisdiction that has an exemption, a residential exemption based on a square foot threshold. And I'd be a little, I'd urge caution on council as using that sort of approach, especially if you're trying to address affordability issues, because there isn't always that connection between a sort of a straight square foot threshold and affordability. So we'd probably have to be a little bit careful about how to do it, how to best do it.
Deputy Warden.
Yeah, well, you know, I understand the challenges with that. I'm just trying to think outside the box in a way that, is there a way that, and maybe it's an agreement that it says this is for first time or, you know, low income. I don't know. I'm just trying to think of something that we struggle with this. We, you know, on our affordable housing committee, we struggle at how to create opportunity. We've seen the high cost of housing. We see the issue around, you know, people struggling to finding housing and maybe it's single unit bachelor park. I don't know. I'm just trying to think of trying to create, does it create an incentive? And maybe it doesn't create an incentive. I don't know, but I'm thinking it would if it was a unit of a 20 unit development that was geared to low income, income to rent, formula or first time, you know, I mean, like Habitat for Humanity, they build houses for first time people and they have to, you know, so, you know, and maybe it's connected to that. I don't know. Maybe Mr. Warden, you can help me out here a little bit, but I'm just trying to think outside the box to try to think of an opportunity that maybe just gives that opportunity for a certain part of our sector that just needs that a little extra helping hand. And I know that the question always is okay, if you give the exemption, does it get translated down into the price, or is the price the market that sells the price? And that's the tough part. We've struggled with this before because, you know, does it get conveyed through and that type of thing? And, you know, I just look at, is there a way to think outside that creates that? And maybe there isn't today, or maybe we got to research that to think of a way, because we don't want to take away from the fundamental part of why we have DC charges, and that's to cover the cost of infrastructure and the use and stuff like that. But I'm just wondering, and maybe Mr. Warden, maybe you got some ideas up your sleeve. I don't know.
Well, it strikes me, Mr. Deputy Warden, that there really are two questions that I'm hearing. One is, can we do this? But then I hear Randy saying, should we do this, even if we can? Randy, I'll turn it to you.
Thank you, and I applaud the thinking outside the box, and I think that's where this council has already demonstrated thinking outside the box when it comes to development charges and trying to encourage the types of development that we want to see in our communities. And with respect to the exemptions that were approved by council in late 2020, with respect to exempting all nonprofit housing developments. So Councilor McQueen mentioned Habitat for Humanity, for example, developments. Any new developments that are proposed by Habitat for Humanity and other nonprofit housing providers, based on what county council approved in the current bylaws anyways, as well as what's reflected still in the proposed draft bylaws, would still be exempted from a development charge. And so we are already seeing some of those developments happening. And I know that through Anne-Marie and working with the non-housing providers, on future projects, I think this would be something that they will greatly welcome. We see that any savings with respect to those DCs hopefully will be put back into creating more housing, more affordable housing through nonprofit housing providers. So I think kudos to council for being thinking outside the box and being innovative already in terms of providing those exemptions. The other key exemption, and I think it's probably a mechanism of being able to put an agreement in place with with current owner of rental apartment buildings. And we've seen as a result of the council's approval to exempt any new purpose-built rental housing from exemptions through what we call a deferral and conditional exemption, where we enter into an agreement with that developer, and as long as they remain as rentals for a period of time, and it's the period of time is 25 years from time of essentially building permit, they will be also exempted from a development charge. And again, this is to try to encourage more new rental housing in our area. I'm pleased to say that we've already entered into several agreements with developers with respect to that, and those housing units are being built as we speak. And we have about 3 or 4 others that I'm aware of at this stage anyways, that we are very close to signing agreements with as well. So in total, I think it's once those other 3 or 4, we're at least 300 plus new residential apartment units that are being created in our communities as a result of those exemptions that council's approved. So I think council's doing some great stuff in terms of providing those exemptions. There's not to say that there's other opportunities, and we're always willing to research and do some further work on those other opportunities. I just, as Stefan indicated, the caution would be moving forward with something like what was suggested. We would just need to do some further research to figure out what that potential impact could be. But we're always willing to explore that based on council's direction for sure.
Thank you, Randy. Councillor Mackey.
Thanks, Mr. Warden. Randy, just to clarify your response about the agreements in place for 25 years, with the developer to make sure they continue to be rental. Is there the same sort of thing in place for secondary units? So if someone's putting a secondary unit, whether it's attached or not attached, on their property, our exemption is for affordable housing and to increase that stock. How do we ensure that doesn't become an Airbnb or a commercial type endeavor after the fact, after the exemption? Do we have anything built in, safeguards built in for the secondary dwellings?
Through you, Mr. Warden, it's a great question. At this stage, we don't. And as Stefan indicated, as part of the Changes to the Development Charges Act, any new and existing secondary dwelling units are exempted as per the Development Charges Act. And in terms of how those secondary units are utilized, outside of having a short-term accommodation type bylaw, similar to what Town of Blue Mountains has in place, to be able to try and regulate some of those potential uses, there's nothing that we have in place here with respect to regulating how those secondary units are utilized. So they could be, I guess, utilized as Airbnbs, but based on some of just stories we've heard in terms of those secondary units, most of them are being utilized for family members. From what we're hearing from people when they're at least putting the new units in, most of them are being used for family members. Some of them may be used for aging family members and other things that they're utilized. So we hope that majority of the percent are being utilized for just creating additional, more affordable housing stock for folks, and hopefully freeing up additional housing stock. So say if people are moving from, say, a house into that secondary unit, their house is now up for sale, hopefully, and therefore it's increasing the overall housing stock as well as a result of that.
I really hope that's the case, Randy, and I think often it is. But even if 10%, will be exempted for other commercial purposes, I don't know if there's any way we can, tie up those loose ends at all. It's just a thought. Thanks.
Okay. Anyone else? No one online? No one present? And wonderful. Thank you very much, Stefan, for your assistance. And we are now looking for a motion to adjourn. So moved by Councillor, Councillor Milne and Councillor Gamble. All those in favor? Any opposed? That is carried. Council